John Brown's last words were, "This is a beautiful country. I did not have the chance to see it before." Today I'm going to be talking about the abolitionist John Brown. Many of us are familiar with that name, but how is he relevant to American history? Well, first I'm going to talk about who John Brown was, what influenced his perspectives of slavery, and his motivations against it. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what actions he took to make himself so well known, and how did he decide upon his fateful raid of Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how that raid affected American society at the time and effectively lit the fuse that ignited the Civil War. So to begin, John Brown was an abolitionist who lived in the decades prior to the Civil War. His abolitionism was heavily influenced by his upbringing. His father, Owen Brown, was deeply religious and strongly opposed to slavery. In his 2011 book, Midnight Rising, journalist and historian Tony Horwitz wrote, quote, "In most respects, Owen Brown's religious faith harked back to his Puritan forebears, who believed that they had a covenant with God to make America a moral beacon to the world. In the 18th century, Calvinist ministers began speaking of slavery as a threat to this special relationship, a breach of divine law that would bring down God's wrath upon the land." And Owen Brown was strongly affected by those preachings, and he would eventually pass his religious fervor and anti-slavery sentiments to his son John. But unlike his father, John Brown was not a pacifist. He believed that violent action akin to the Old Testament was not only acceptable but necessary to achieve the abolition of slavery. So now that we know what influenced John Brown, what actions did he take to make himself so well known? I think I most associate John Brown when I was first learning about him with Bloody Kansas, which was where settlers from the North and the South skirmished against one another for control of the state. And John Brown's own hands were bloodied as he was heavily involved in the guerrilla warfare here between these two factions. After this violence in Kansas, the militia he organized there started carrying out a small number of raids into slave states where they freed a small number of slaves. And it was those types of raids that John Brown sought to replicate on a grander scale. And that's when he set his sights on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Virginia was a slave state, and Harper's Ferry was home to a federal armory, which it was Brown's intention to capture and confiscate the weapons there and put them to use for his style of guerrilla warfare. So about 3 years after he left Kansas, him and 18 men successfully attacked and captured this federal armory in Harper's Ferry. They were unsuccessful in making off with the weapons as they were pinned down by local authorities until about a day later when a company of U.S. Marines arrived and recaptured the armory. And those members of Brown's militia who weren't killed in the fighting were captured, put on trial, and eventually sentenced to hang to death, Brown himself included. So now we know what actions made Brown so well known in America. How did his raid at Harper's Ferry ignite the Civil War? Well, his raid divided the nation like it never had been before. This question of slavery had dogged American politics for decades, and while the North was largely abolitionist, very few people agreed with Brown's views that force would be needed to invade, to put an end to slavery. And this began to change as his execution loomed near and sympathies for his cause began to grow in the North. Now, as far as the South was concerned, they were determined to see Brown hanged for his crimes. In his book, originally published in 1967, The Trial of John Brown, novelist and historian Thomas Fleming said, quote, "Many in the South were eager to see Brown die, no matter the consequences. A Richmond newspaper declared, though it convert the whole Northern people, without an exception, into furious armed abolition invaders, old Brown would be hung." And it was that perception the South had of the North, as on the verge of becoming a million John Browns and invading the South and violently overthrowing slavery, that set the South on the path to seceding from the Union. And they kind of made their perception of the North a self-fulfilling prophecy when they did secede and soon attacked Fort Sumter, kind of forcing the North's hand and launching the country into a bloody civil war. So in conclusion, I told you about who John Brown was, what influenced him. I told you about what actions he took to make himself so well known. And I told you about how his reign at Harper's Ferry lit the fuse that sparked the Civil War. So the next time you hear John Brown, the abolitionist, mentioned, you'll have a little bit better understanding of his relevance to American history. Thank you for listening.